I hope you can hear me. Welcome to this session. As you're coming in, just put your name in the chat. Say where you're coming to us from today, what the weather's like, anything you feel like. It's Friday, we're heading to the weekend. It will take a couple of minutes for people to come in, so it will be really useful if you just make your presence felt in the chat. Be nice for us to know who's joining us today. Welcome everyone. Yep, as I said before, just as you're arriving, just put your name, where you're coming to us from today, or where you are today, what the weather's like where you are, anything you feel like, really, your life in 6 words if you like, and we'll just give it a minute or so more, waiting for everybody to come in. Yeah, so just a little bit more. That's it. Hope you're having a good day today. Hope you've been able to access lots of great sessions, or at the very least, if you're in school and you're coming just for this session, then I hope you've got lots saved for catch up later. There is an absolute wealth of brilliant sessions here at the conference, so I'm sure that you have. I think we can probably make a start now, and we'll need to, because there's quite a lot in the session. So I am committed to stopping on time. Do put questions in the Q&A. I won't stop for them now. I'll hopefully have time for them at the end. But just to say that my contact details, you can email me through the website that you can see the address of there on screen. You can tweet me at RachelHawks60. If you, just while I'm introducing myself and getting the session started, if you feel like, no compulsion to do so, but I would love to know who I've engaged with today, particularly if you teach in England, and not to exclude anyone that doesn't, but that's my particular remit at the moment, is working with teachers in England. So if you want to just put your device over that QR code, there's a very, very, very small Google form to fill in, where I'll just be able to see who's been at the session today. So that would be much appreciated. Obviously, it's not compulsory. You're free not to do that, of course. All right, so let's get started. My name's Rachel Hawks. I'm really pleased to be with you this afternoon. I'm a languages teacher and leader, and currently seconded from my trust, the CAM Academy Trust, to work as co-director of NCELP, the National Centre for Excellence for Language Pedagogy. The big ideas, the 3 big ideas that we're going to explore in this session, are drawn from the principles of language-led pedagogy developed by NCELP in the last 4 years or so, since autumn 2018. And while the specific remit of the centre is French, German, Spanish, the ideas are practically mostly all applicable to other languages, even to Chinese, and anyone excited by the possibilities of curriculum design and teaching that these ideas offer is really, really welcome to attend the free training in the spring term, and there's a link to that at the end. I can't get started properly without a shout out to Professor Emma Marsden, who's director of NCELP, and whose determination to bring research and practice as close together as possible and whose amazingly unswerving ability to think outside the box has been an inspiration to me over the last few years and has steered this project from its beginning. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. So main drivers for change of all kinds are probably these two: solving problems that come our way and seizing opportunities. And more often than not, we embrace change when we absolutely have to. And in education, that's often due to policy change, a new national examination, for example, and that is currently the case for French, German and Spanish in our schools. And more about that tomorrow in the GCSE session, if you want to join me for that. Obviously for Chinese, another language which is being taught increasingly more frequently in this country, a change of GCSE exam is not imminent. However, that's not to say that there aren't really strong reasons for seizing some of the opportunities for rethinking some of our ideas about curriculum design and about activity types. So we're going to focus on 3 strong ideas that suggest why we might want to make some changes to our languages teaching and our curriculum, even if we didn't have to. And so these ideas are interrelated. The first one is about content. So it's about what we teach, but it's also, and perhaps more importantly, about the order in which we teach it. So the sequencing. What drives this? What drives the sequencing, the order in which we teach language? And in a textbook course, for example, what is the underlying rationale for the choice of language and the order in which it's being presented? Often we find, to date anyway, that it's the topics that drive the content. And this is currently the case for all textbooks that I'm familiar with. And there are some issues with that. So for example, in a really popular Year 7 French textbook, in the first half term, there are 6 different types of question formation in use. And pupils that are really just getting underway on their language journey can't possibly learn, assimilate, and be able to manipulate those structures that fast so that they could create their own meanings, their own questions independently from them. So they have to, if they're going to go this way, learn them as sort of one use chunks, if you like. And this is an example of the topic, and in this case it would be personal ID, personal identification, in the first half term of Year 7, sort of leading the way, leading and pushing the language sequencing rather than the other way round. Okay, so that's one idea that we're going to come back to and explore in this session. Second idea is retention. And we know that the current government and Ofsted agenda is all about knowledge in all subjects, and the mantra is in all subjects that pupils need to know more, remember more, and be able to do more. This is just not a new idea for us as language teachers. We know the importance of retention. We know that vocabulary knowledge is the single biggest factor in proficiency and in attainment in examinations. However, to meet that challenge, remembering the words over time, including how they sound, how they're pronounced, how they, what they mean, how they're written, we can't just present and practice words once or twice and then expect them with any confidence to know them. So we need to think about retention and plan that into our schemes of work fairly systematically, so that those schemes of work are like expanding practice schedules, that as new language is introduced, they get bigger and bigger, but they don't forget to keep revisiting and reteaching previously taught words at several intervals. And you know, any published course, whichever one it is, just doesn't have enough pages to do that required amount of revisiting. So it's really, really important that we create schemes of work that do it. There's also a problem here if we are too closely tied to topics. So if you need to revisit language very often to learn it, then the majority of the words that we teach can't be too closely tied to just one topic. Because if they are, then every time we want to revisit those words, we have to revisit the same topic over and over again. And that would get really, really tiring, boring very quickly. So what we need to spend the majority of our learning time on is words that can be used across at least 2 or 3 topics. And those words are obviously the high frequency words, precisely because they can be used across 2 or 3 topics. So we need our teaching to contain a majority of those words. We need to find several topics in which to use them. Otherwise, words get trapped in these topic silos. A consequence of that is that pupils will only recognize a word when it is in the mix with a familiar phrase that have other words in which they've practiced it. And that's usually just the one phrase. So in current GCSE examinations that have still got 2 or 3 years to run, this is flagged as an issue in the examiner's reports, where students weren't able to recognize the meanings of words that were either presented individually, like bullets on a writing exam, or they occurred in listening and readings, but in a different topic area from the one in which they were originally taught and learned. And so that is a problem, and we'll look at that as one of our big ideas too. Third one, cross-linguistic difficulty. So this is the fact that, and I'm focusing in our context, but this idea is extrapolatable, if that's a word, to other contexts as well. But thinking about L1 English-speaking learners of other languages, there will be certain features that will be harder to reach, harder to learn than others, depending on the degree to which they differ from English, particularly in terms of word order or morphology, the forms of the words, or the sound-writing relationship. And one kind of obvious example is the yes-no question, which is problematic for learners of most languages. English speakers signal a yes-no question at the start with an inverted auxiliary verb, do you, are you, and we rely on that cue to know it's a question. And obviously we've got the intonation in speaking going up. Whereas, for example, in Chinese, the only difference between a statement and its equivalent question is the ma at the end. And that's something which is often missed by English learners of Chinese because it's at the end, which is a strange place for it to be as far as we're concerned. And then obviously, whilst in reading, we'll get the cue of the written punctuation, question mark. But in listening, when you're already overloaded with quite a lot to process, we lack the early cue of that verb inversion at the front, but also we don't have the rising intonation convincingly at the end. So those sorts of things can be really tricky for learners and need particular practice. And there are obviously countless examples of these key differences between English and other languages that our pupils are learning. So overall, our umbrella principle here is that there is some bad difficulty to be avoided. And by bad, I mean, that sounds, like a very black and white word, but I mean here sort of unnecessary difficulty or unhelpful difficulty is probably a better term. And we want to build in desirable difficulty. We're not talking about smoothing the way and making it entirely easy. We're talking about different types of difficulty, and there is helpful difficulty and unhelpful difficulty. And that's what we're going to unpack in this session. So let's start with, if I can move on, let's start with word selection, so content, so looking at the language selection and the sequencing. As we talked about before, most textbooks will teach personal identification in the first term of year 7, and so age comes into that because it belongs to the topic. In French, giving your age involves the verb avoir, which is the verb that typically or prototypically means have, but we see immediately that this structure therefore hasn't got word for word equivalents with English because we don't use have for giving age, we use be. If, and this is where the sequencing bit is really important, if it's taught before pupils are taught the more common meaning of avoir, it can encourage pupils to think that avoir means be, not have. And even when we say it's fine because we tell them that avoir means have, they haven't practiced that. They haven't practiced that with the more logical nouns and indefinite articles. They haven't got that sort of embedded practice and knowledge that avoir means have. And it doesn't therefore stop pupils from using suis to give their age. In addition, the question form that we need for this, quel âge as-tu or tu as quel âge, has 4 forms actually. It has masculine singular, feminine singular, masculine plural, which has got an extra L in there that it didn't need, sorry about that, and feminine plural. And that's not that straightforward. Pupils will assume that quel just means which, and that there are no other forms of quel, and actually quel acts like an adjective, and so it's put in here in isolation as part of a chunk. It can't then be extrapolated and used with other nouns. It can only here be used with âge, because that's all they know to fit it with. Pupils learn that an means years, but they don't then learn that an without an S means year. They might do if the teacher wants to tell them that at that point, but it's not usually highlighted in the textbook. And if we introduce this sort of single-use chunk, like I am years old, then the sentence can only really be varied at this point in the learner's journey by putting different numbers in, not by varying other sentence components like what age is he, what age are they? And the numbers are a little bit limited, because if you're teaching a class, a school age class, you're only going to have 2 different numbers to vary it between, unless they're going to pretend to be all sorts of different people of different ages. So all this to say that there are language-driven reasons, really good reasons, I think, strong reasons, not to make age the first time pupils meet avoir. But, can we just explore for a minute, is there an overriding communication need for pupils who are in their first term of year 7 to be able to say their age? Would they be disappointed? Would their needs not be met if they came to the class and didn't learn that? I'm just not convinced. I'm not convinced they come with an expectation that they're going to learn how to say their age in the first term. So I think it can be saved up for later. This to me would be a case for avoiding unhelpful difficulty. And then how we might build in desirable difficulty, we'll have a look at in just a second. So in the case of the NCELT French curriculum, we decided to introduce avoir, first of all, with the meaning have, for quite some time before we ever got to its other idiomatic meaning of be. And we introduced it with indefinite articles and high frequency nouns, because that seemed like a logical pairing, having something, having a something, talking about what you have, talking about what others have. This does have a one-to-one correlation with English. So it's moving from teaching something complex, but having to teach it as a chunk because it's a bit too complex for them to learn the component parts at this stage, turning it round to teaching them actually something that they can learn from the bottom up. There is one-to-one equivalence. And if we introduce 3 singular persons, we get multi-use out of it. We get varied sentence building from the start. And that seems to be important. So how to build in the good difficulty then? So whilst I just demonstrated there how we were easing the way and starting with less complex so that pupils have got a way to build up sentences from the word go, I did also promise that this wasn't about just saying, right, let's airbrush French and make it easier and do it step by step. I do think that, but there is some good difficulty. So let's look then at what good or desirable difficulty might look like in the same sort of grammar arena, in the same feature of avoir in its singular persons and some nouns. So we might start by providing a really succinct, explicit description of the grammar feature before practice. Why would we do that? Well, it can help learners to understand the meaning, the function of the grammar feature, and there is a significant body of research to support this. And for me, I have to be compelled, it has to convince me. So for me, as a teacher, the most compelling way to see this, I think, is as leveling the playing field for all the learners that I've encountered ever. We know that learners aren't the same. We know that they bring different analytical abilities to their learning. And we also know now from research that language analytical ability predicts foreign language success or foreign language proficiency, even in really young learners of 8 to 9 years old. Excitingly, so there's a good part to this story, we also know that if we start early, or whenever we start actually, but starting early is going to be a good plan, we can improve this ability through instruction. And when we do that, and when we are explicit and we give practice in the grammar and we give explicit explanations, this leads to less variation in performance. So we're doing that very specifically to close that gap between learners with a higher innate language analytical ability. You know, we all know those learners where you could put them in a padded cell with a grammar book and they'd come out being able to manipulate language. But there are many, many other learners for whom that is not the case. So it is about closing the gap, leveling the playing field for them. And this explanation should be quite specific. So it should describe what the grammar is for, its meaning, not just how you make it. So here it says, you know, to talk in French about what you have, use avoir. It's also really helpful for, obviously for English speaking, English L1 speakers, to be aware of the relationship between English and the L2. And that's always the case, but particularly where the relationship is complex, so there's not a one-to-one relationship. But the purpose of the explanation is not an end in itself. It's to boost their noticing. It's to boost their noticing of particular features that they are just about to practice in the listening and reading. And it helps all learners, so all learners of all analytic abilities, to see the patterns which only some learners would be able to spot for themselves if they went straight into practice. So it's not a learning activity in itself. It is, together with the practice that follows, a brief pre-learning booster before that all-important practice in input and output. It has been established in research that by far the most meaningful bit, by far the most beneficial bit, is the amount and nature of the practice that follows the explanation, but the explanation has a place. So after that explanation, which has not been written down and cogitated over, it's just been a brief moment to raise awareness, we would go into an activity. And this is a reading one, it could have been a listening one, but the good or desirable difficulty here is that pupils have been robbed of some of the information. They do not have the pronouns to rely on. And we rely on pronouns in English because we have very few inflections on our verbs. We only have the singular S. So we use the pronouns to decide or to know who's doing what to the verb. And so it's natural that an English speaking learner will gravitate and hook on to the pronoun and will kind of ignore the differences, the morphology of the verbs. That's kind of logical. That makes sense to me. So verb forms are harder to reach grammar for English native speakers because verbs are far less marked. So here we make the verb form essential. You can't do this activity by relying on a pronoun because there is no pronoun. So we are contrasting a pair of features, again, reducing the load, but narrowing the focus such that you have to process the knowledge. It has to be only by looking at the e or the a can you decide who's doing what here or who has what in this particular case. You can see that the form, so whether it's AI or whether it's a, is 100% connected to meaning. They are deciding who has it. Is it Leah who's speaking, so I, or is it Amir who's being talked about, who's he? The principle is to compel learners always to focus on the essential hard to reach bit of the feature and make them choose often between two contrasting features, as we've got here. We can do similar things in listening as well, before also practicing the same targeted task essential feature in speaking and writing. And this obviously there is research on this as well, but the bits that really stand out for me is that there is a benefit to making pupils make that correct connection between the form, the grammar feature form, and its meaning, and and to doing that in listening and reading. Okay, so let's wait for my computer to catch up. Obviously, it's really important not to forget the whole message. We need to comprehend, we need to understand the full message, not just the persons of avoir. So having identified the who has, they then here focus on the what. So what does each person have? So we're processing the nouns. Now these input activities, these input processing activities in listening and reading are missing from current published courses, where you generally get a grammar explanation, and that leads into some kind of practice, generally writing practice. Sometimes that writing practice is form only and doesn't actually compel learners to connect the meaning to the form. And we can fill that gap. So we can create these sorts of input processing activities, and we can insert them into our practice. The example here that I've just shown is really, really simple and can be extrapolated to all sorts of other verbs, obviously. With some grammar features, they can be a bit of a brain ache to create, if I'm honest, but every single NSELP lesson has examples of them for every grammar feature at Key Stage 3. We're creating new resources for the new grammar features at Key Stage 4 that are on the new GCSE content. There's a link there to NSELP resources, or use the QR code, or just Google NSELP resources, and you will find a lot of material. So I won't dwell on this summary, but this is our first big idea done, so that we are saying that we mustn't forget the value of being driven by the language itself when it comes to selecting content and sequencing it in a useful order, progressing from simple to complex in terms of the structures we choose, but then designing in our desirable difficulty that really helps pupils focus by using these pairs of features, and by that interleaving the I form with the he, she form, making them compare, contrast, make the decision, make that connection. Okay, so on to our second big idea, retention, or remembering language over the long term. As teachers, we are often thinking about this. So we're extremely, extremely keen to know how we can design our curricula and how we can teach activities that maximize our students' success. And a large part of language learning success is down to remembering the words, remembering the language that we've taught them. And we already looked at how part of that is about getting the order right in which we teach the words and grammar, and avoiding that unnecessary or unhelpful difficulty, and then how we can build in the specific focus and create that desirable difficulty. But here, to complement that idea, we consider the fact that students need to practice the words that they are learning many, many, many times over, many more times over than I thought 4 or 5 years ago. And that in order to do that, there have to be opportunities for the words to come back time and time again, but without the need to repeat the same topic each time. We can't do school every 4 weeks, but we need to repeat language 4 weeks, after 3 months, after a year. But are we going to do school as a topic each time we do that? So here's an example from the NSELP scheme of work for Year 7, showing that all the words are introduced and then revisited at intervals. And we can see that we've got a week 2 to then a week 5 to then a week 10. And that does extend then into assessments. It then extends into Year 8. All of these words come back in Year 8, they come back in Year 9, and they all come back 3 times in the Year 10 and 11 scheme of work at Key Stage 4. Twice they come up sort of thematically, appropriately, where they're needed. And right at the end, there's a 9-week period of time for revisiting every single word on the GCSE word list. So we're not complacent about this one. We know that it needs to be as many times as possible. Some of these words will come back incidentally on top of that. So it may be 15, 20 times that they've had them, but we at least need to plan in a good stock of around 10 times for each word over the course of their learning journey. Instead of, though, needing to repeat the same topic 3 weeks later and 9 weeks later, the words can be practiced in different topics. And you can see that yes, they're a little bit more general than some of the topics that we've been used to of old, but that's to accommodate the higher frequency and the less topic specificness, which I've explained the need for. But describing a thing or person, I mean, that is something that we do. Distinguish between things you have, your possessions, and how you are, what you're like. Again, not really difficult to see how that isn't a useful context to work with. Saying what people like to do, preferred activities, again, not difficult to see. It's not a million miles away from the topics that we are very, very familiar with from our previous courses. Sources of high frequency words, accepting that those are useful. French, German and Spanish, the job's been done for us. So we have the new draft GCSE word lists based on the Routledge frequency dictionaries, published yesterday and today, hot off the press for all of the awarding bodies. AQA, Pearson and Educas have published their SAMs that they've now submitted to Ofqual, and more about the new GCSE in tomorrow's talk. But for Chinese as well, that isn't getting a new GCSE, still, hopefully, if you're following the train of the big ideas, still a reason to look at frequency. There's also a Routledge Dictionary of Chinese, the most common 5,000 words, and that is a paid for resource that you can get on Amazon, but there are other things that I found. So I found a Wiktionary Mandarin frequency list of the most common 1 to 1,000 words. I haven't investigated what sits behind it, but it is free, so it's worth having a look at. I'm not good enough at Chinese to really know what I'm looking at, but I'm sure many of you are. The HSK leveled lists that are available in the public domain, what I have managed to find out is that they do try and approach vocabulary selection based on frequency of use in those lists. What they don't do, of course, is necessarily take into account the complexity of the character. So the word might be super frequent, but that benefit might be offset by just the level of complexity in learning how to write it. Of course, the frequency, as for all frequency lists, is based on vocabulary used daily by native speakers in that country. It doesn't correlate particularly well with current GCSE topics, but that's where we do have to consider what we're teaching and why we're teaching it. So surely if our aim is to teach pupils ultimately to communicate in the language, then teaching them a majority of words, not exclusive, but a majority of words that are used most often by speakers of that language, that would be a pretty sound approach in my view. Okay, so retention works best when we systematically revisit words and structures. We don't leave it to chance. And one of the typical things which, you know, has been in my practice for a long time, or was in my practice for a long time, was, and in our department's practice as well, not just me, was that sort of constant knowledge of the importance of revisiting. So we would revisit from the previous week or the previous lesson. We'd always do a starter. That you know, that is taken as read. I think that's part of every teacher's repertoire. But what is less clear to me is how we are doing the revisiting that happens in a spaced way after the forgetting has started to happen. And that forgetting bit is an important stage in the learning. So the memories need not to be completely cold. So if we teach words in week 1 and then we revise them the week before the end of term test, they've probably gone cold by that stage, and it will be like learning them again from the beginning. But after 3 weeks, after 9 weeks, and then for the end of term test, well, that's a different matter. So making use of this spacing is strong for retention. Making use of the interleaving of contrasting features is also strong for retention. When practice can be skill specific, so making sure that the vocabulary we're teaching is practiced across all the modes and modalities, because knowledge is skill specific. So we need to make practice skill specific as well, to make it as robust as possible and to really support that retention. So if we consider word frequency, That will be helpful because then we can do that repetition of language without having to repeat the same topic. We design it into a schedule so that no one forgets, everyone can just follow it. And we ensure sufficient meaningful practice across all the skills, all the modes and modalities, listening, speaking, reading, writing. And it's worth just dwelling for a moment on the concept of meaningful practice, because meaningful means all sorts of things to us. We use that outside of the teaching arena, but meaningful practice in this context is the opposite of mechanical. So practice is meaningful when you can only complete an activity by thinking about meaning and form. So if one of those bits is missing, and usually what gets to be missed is the meaning, then the practice is not as strong and arguably not meaningful in this sense, if this is how we're defining meaningful. And, obviously as teachers, we're always looking for new practice activities that we hope to engage our learners with. We're always under that pressure, time pressure the whole time. So our attention, and we have writer's block as well. On the night before, we need to plan 6 lessons, and we just don't have enough time or enough energy, and our attention could be drawn to a particular activity that we hear about, that everyone seems to be raving about. So we try it out as well, and our students enjoy it, and we want to do it again, and we're encouraged by that enthusiasm. But we haven't always had the time to really ask ourselves what exactly is being practiced in that activity. In this type of activity, for example, it's worth asking ourselves whether or not we can be sure that our learners will keep any connection between the written form of these sentences and what they actually mean. So they're reading them aloud, but at no point is it important that either the person listening or the person speaking knows what those sentences mean. They just have to recognize what's being said and connect it to a number. So I'm not sure that in this case we could say, look, that 5 minutes is being spent on meaningful practice, and maybe we can go, oh, we can throw that 5 minutes away. But I think knowing what we know about the number of times we need to make those form meaning connections for retention to happen, I think we will just want to actively prefer really meaningful practice activities. Okay, so our third big idea, and I'm watching the clock, is concerning cross-linguistic difficulty. And it's the idea that it's really helpful for us as teachers to identify in as much detail and as clearly as we can those aspects of the new language that present real difficulties for our learners. And if you are a teacher, I'm sure you have identified, however long your teaching career has been, a whole bunch of these from your teaching experience, and that you use every opportunity in the classroom as they arise, reactively to point them out to students. But this is the idea that we might go a little bit further than that. And I'm suggesting that rather than sort of react to errors, that we actually might use our knowledge of cross-linguistic difficulty as part of our curriculum design and as part of our planned lesson activities. And again, we'll see that these ideas really do overlap, but I think it's worth still showing a few examples. So cross-linguistic difficulty can include many different aspects of the language, any one where there's a real difference between the L1, so in this case we're thinking English, and the new language that's being learned. So it can include the morphology, and we saw that with avoir. It can include the syntax, so the order of words in a sentence can be very different between the two languages. It can include the sound-writing relationship. It can include words that have multiple meanings, and many high-frequency words do have multiple meanings. And how do we get at that? How do we make sure that we don't kind of miss that along the way? Because those words are going to be really important for understanding sentences. What about the additional and omitted words? Chinese, we've got the obvious measure words and the particle de, but with articles in French, German and Spanish, when do we use the article? When do we not use it? There are differences of use there between English and Spanish. There are many, many, many parts of speech where the word is the same, but they have different functions. Those are often tricky as well. And then we've got the high frequency idioms, and we already saw an example of that with the avoir one. So I've got in the next 4 slides, very quickly, a few examples in different languages of how we can get at some of these things in our planning and in our teaching activities. So this one, a morphology one, rests on the contrast between I in the present tense and he in the past tense with AR verbs, which differ only by an accent and therefore a stress. So as you can see in that first question there, we've got cuando usó el ordenador, and because it's got the accent on and because the stress therefore falls there, usó, that makes it he used in the simple past, whereas if the question were cuando uso el ordenador, that would be yo normalmente, me in the present tense. So you can see the difference is tiny, the meaning difference is huge, and being able to detect the difference here, given that Spanish often doesn't use pronouns, will be extremely, extremely important to students right now for GCSE and to students in their later lives, obviously, as well, when they use language for all sorts of purposes. So planning in these contrasting activities. This is a reading where we need to understand, first of all, whether we're talking about I, normalmente, or el, ayer. And we do that by focusing in on the only thing that tells us, which is the verb form. And obviously, we're not just going to stop there. We're going to want to understand what these questions have actually been asking. And so to get at that nicely without just doing a translation exercise, which would be completely valid in terms of do they know the meaning, but not necessarily that interactive or that communicative, we can actually fill in the dialogue by giving some answers, but jumble them so that pupils have to match the correct. So we've got respuestas posibles and they need to match those up. So you can see there that often these activities will have 2 stages. One is to get at the hard to reach contrast, and then one is a broader comprehension principle. We won't look at the listening example, but it's, those are similar. A syntax example, a quick Chinese one. Question words in Chinese don't routinely come at the beginning, but they do in English. All of our which, what, how words come at the beginning. And that can sometimes confuse learners and confuse them between questions and statements unless they pay very close attention to the individual words themselves. So this difference in syntax is worth us planning some activities for. And here we have a listening where obviously in writing you'd be able to see, is it punctuated as a question or punctuated as a statement? But in listening, we don't have that. So this is a listening activity where pupils need to identify and punctuate either with a question mark or a sentence. If I play it.
第一个，你是英国人。
So you might have guessed that was a statement, but if we were to listen to them all, there are at least 3 in here that sound plausibly like they could be statements, but they're questions, or the other way around. So I can see that I'm actually just 1 minute away from time, so I'm going to move on from that one. I've written lots of notes under the slide, which you're very welcome to have. Last thing then, in German, French and Spanish, cognates can be a source of cross-linguistic difficulty. We often think that they're so useful and they're a cross-linguistic facilitator, which they also are. But when it comes to the oral modality, understanding them in listening and producing them in speaking is difficult and provides learners with a real source of cognitive conflict. So this activity meets that head on. We've set them up knowing that the general pattern is that stress in German forms of cognates comes towards the end of the word, whilst in English we most often stress the first syllable. And then we've underlined the syllables that get stressed, because this is early stages with this whole sort of read aloud at paragraph level. And so learners practice it with the underlined bits to really experience how German they can sound when they've got that support. And then we take that away and they repeat the task, because repeating speaking tasks is a really, really good way to embed the learning and improve. So any kind of speaking task, whether it's read aloud or whether it's an interaction task, repeating them is really helpful and important. The audio is embedded in this. This is from the Year 9 German scheme of work in week 1. Again, this is my last example.
Je suis.
Polysemy. So, you know, I've always, if you ask me what dans means, I would have always told you that it means in. And I might have said it means into. But I never would have really thought that actually sometimes we would just translate it as to, in fact. And so really,
Je suis.
We've got lots of lovely audio in this one. But just
Je.
thinking about the difference, what is the pivotal difference here between whether we translate dans as in or dans as to, and that is the use of the verb. So we've got either être for if we're saying I'm in, which is logical, but je vais being when we might use dans to mean to. Again, just connecting those dots for pupils and practicing them in an exercise. So recognizing that the multiple meanings of words and really important words, because dans has got a frequency rating of 11. That means it's the 11th most used word in the French language. Definitely worth us spending some time on. And there's a listening activity here where part of what they have to do, not all of it, is to decide whether they're listening to dans meaning in or dans meaning to, which we won't listen to right now. So having gone over for a minute, I'm very nearly there. We can use this cross-linguistic difficulty as a real source of inspiration for meeting head on and addressing it in our planning, in our task design. And it means that we, after having identified those hard to reach features, we design activities that contrast those tricky forms, those meaning pairs, and we get those into our scheme of work and create some really meaningful practice. Okay, so thank you for listening. If you're interested in thinking more about these ideas, if they're interesting to you, I can really recommend NSELP's free CPD course. You do need to be a secondary teacher in England, but as long as that's you, you please visit the NSELP website. There's a self-access course that you can do in your own time. Even if you are not a teacher in England, I have a feeling that you can probably now access the self-access course, not the taught one, but the self-access course in your own time. So do email in and see. There's a blended version of the course also, which combines the self-study with Teach Meets for an opportunity to engage on these ideas with a course leader and other teachers. If you want to be in touch with me, those are the ways. If you would not mind, and you haven't got to leap off right this second, just grabbing that QR code and doing me a 1-question feedback survey, including, if you want to, there's space for you to add other things and say what you'd like to know more about in future sessions, or whatever you feel like saying. But it could just be a 1-question, 10-second survey. And I'd really, really appreciate hearing from you, because this feels like I'm talking to a vacuum. I don't really know who I'm talking to, and it would be really nice to know. I wish you a very, very, very happy onward journey to your next webinar. Hope you have a brilliant 3 days if you're in it for the duration. I hope you enjoy every session, and it's been really lovely to talk to you. I am back tomorrow talking about the new GCSE, or if you're a primary teacher, talking about teaching primary languages. So I look forward to seeing more of you there. Thanks very much, and goodbye. Right, now I need to work out how to stop recording. Somehow I don't seem to be. managing. Thanks, everybody. I need to work out how to